Keanu Reeves stood in the first-class line at Los Angeles International Airport, his appearance a stark contrast to the opulence surrounding him. Dressed in a simple plaid shirt, worn-out jeans, and scuffed boots, he carried a weathered backpack that seemed to have accompanied him on countless journeys. There was nothing flashy about him, and perhaps because of that he blended into the background, unnoticed by most. Yet, for those who took a closer look, there was something undeniably different about him. It wasn't just his attire, but the serene calmness he exuded. While the airport buzzed with the usual chaos, people rushing, luggage rolling, and conversations blending into a cacophony, Keanu stood still, observing his surroundings with a quiet mindfulness, as if he were completely at peace amidst the turmoil. Behind him in the line stood Victor Harding, a man who couldn't have been more different from Keanu. Victor was the epitome of luxury, dressed in an expensive tailored suit, polished shoes, and a cologne that announced his presence before he even spoke. Every movement he made was deliberate, as though he were constantly performing for an audience. His eyes scanned the line, and when they landed on Keanu, he couldn't resist making a comment. "First class, huh?" Victor said with a smirk, his tone dripping with irony. "You never know who might show up here these days." Keanu turned his head slightly, meeting Victor's gaze with the same calm expression he'd maintained all along. "Yeah," he replied simply. "The world is full of surprises." Victor frowned, clearly expecting a more defensive reaction. He had hoped his comment would ruffle Keanu's feathers, but the man's composure remained unshaken. Unwilling to let it go, Victor pressed further. "Look, nothing personal," he said, chuckling softly. "But you don't seem like the type who flies like this. It's rare to see someone so casual in first class." Keanu didn't respond immediately. Instead, he turned his attention back to the line, which had begun to move as boarding commenced. Victor, feeling slightly emboldened by what he perceived as a lack of resistance, followed closely behind, his polished shoes clicking against the floor with every confident step. Keanu, on the other hand, walked at the same unhurried pace, seemingly unbothered by the commotion around him. When they finally entered the plane, Victor's confidence took a hit. As he checked his ticket and glanced up, he saw Keanu settling into the seat right next to his. "You've gotta be kidding me," Victor muttered under his breath, shaking his head in disbelief. He sat down beside Keanu and let out a low, humorless chuckle. Of all the places possible, it had to be here. Keanu looked at him with that same calm demeanor and offered a slight smile. "Looks like we're traveling together," he said politely. Victor crossed his arms, trying to mask his discomfort. It wasn't just the fact that he was sitting next to Keanu. It was the realization that the man he had judged so harshly moments ago was now sharing the same exclusive space as him. There was something about Keanu's presence that unsettled Victor, though he couldn't quite put his finger on why. As the plane took off and the in-flight service began, Victor decided to strike up another conversation, though his tone remained condescending. "So, what do you do for a living?" he asked, his voice laced with faux curiosity. He already assumed he knew the answer, but wanted to hear it from Keanu himself. Keanu, who was adjusting his backpack under the seat in front of him, looked up and answered simply, "I work in film." Victor raised his eyebrows, feigning surprise. "Oh, I see. Commercials? Small-time stuff?" Keanu gave a slight smile and shook his head. "Something like that." Victor laughed, though there was no warmth in it. "I've always found it interesting how people try to find their place, you know? But sometimes certain spaces just aren't meant for everyone. Like first class, for instance." Keanu met his gaze, his expression calm but firm. "I think we all have our place," he replied. "And sometimes it's exactly where we are." Victor let out a short, dismissive laugh. "That's nice. Kind of philosophical even." But real life isn't that simple. Keanu didn't respond immediately. Instead, he turned to look out the window as if the conversation were over. But Victor wasn't done yet. He leaned slightly toward Keanu, his voice taking on a sharper edge. "You know what?" Victor said, his tone dripping with superiority. "You might be sitting here, but there are things money can't buy. Some places will never really belong to certain people." This time, Keanu didn't respond with words. He simply looked at Victor for a moment, his expression a blend of patience and quiet resolve. It was the kind of look that spoke volumes without uttering a single word. Victor, realizing his provocation hadn't had the desired effect, leaned back into his seat with a satisfied smile. He thought he had the upper hand, but the truth was that things were only just beginning. As the flight progressed, the tension between the two men became palpable. Victor, determined to assert his dominance, continued to make snide remarks, while Keanu remained unflappable, his calmness only serving to frustrate Victor further. The other passengers began to take notice, their whispers and glances making it clear that Victor's arrogance was becoming increasingly uncomfortable to witness. When the flight attendant returned to offer another round of drinks, Victor seized the opportunity to continue his verbal sparring. "You know," he began, gesturing with his champagne glass, "life is like flying first class. You work hard, earn your spot, and then you get to enjoy it. But some people, well, it seems like they're only here because they got lucky." Keanu placed his water bottle on the tray table and turned to face Victor, his gaze steady and unwavering. "Luck or hard work," he said, his voice calm but firm. "We all end up in the same place when the flight lands, don't we?" The cabin fell silent, the weight of Keanu's words hanging in the air. Passengers exchanged glances, some nodding in agreement, while others looked at Victor with thinly veiled disapproval. Victor, clearly unnerved by the response, tried to laugh it off, but his discomfort was evident. "That's a good one," he said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "First-class self-help philosophy. Maybe you should consider giving motivational talks." Keanu simply smiled and turned back to face forward, ending the conversation without another word. His calmness spoke louder than any retort ever could, and the passengers around them began to react subtly. Some whispered to one another, while others cast disapproving glances in Victor's direction. As the flight continued, Victor found himself increasingly unsettled. He had entered the plane confident in his superiority, but Keanu's quiet strength and unwavering composure had shaken him to his core. By the time the plane landed, Victor was a changed man, his arrogance replaced by a newfound humility. The encounter had left an indelible mark on him, a reminder that true worth is not measured by wealth or status, but by how one treats others. For Keanu, it was just another day, another moment of quiet grace in a world that often values noise over substance. And for the passengers who witnessed the exchange, it was a lesson in humility, kindness, and the power of quiet strength. A couple seated a few rows behind, who seemed to have recognized Keanu, remained silent, respecting his privacy, but clearly admiring the way he handled the situation. Meanwhile, Victor began to notice he was being watched, and not in a positive way. His posture, once so confident, began to shift slightly, though he still wasn't ready to admit he had lost control. Victor thought he was winning the dispute, but the reactions around him told a different story. He didn't yet know that what was coming next would make him question everything he believed about status, power, and respect. As the flight attendant passed by, collecting empty glasses, Victor seemed determined to win the debate he had started. "You know what's funny?" Victor continued, his tone dripping with condescension. "People who have nothing to show for themselves always talk about things like humility and simplicity. Ever notice that?" Keanu leaned forward slightly, locking eyes with Victor. "I've noticed that sometimes the people who talk the most about what they have are the ones who feel the emptiest inside." His words hung in the air for a few seconds. and Victor seemed momentarily stunned, struggling to find a response. He opened his mouth, but couldn't immediately form the right words. Passengers around them exchanged glances, some visibly impressed by the way Keanu handled the provocation. "Look, I don't mean to be rude," Victor said finally, recovering his composure. "But the world is competitive. If you don't show what you have, people will ignore you. That's just how things work." Keanu leaned back in his seat and replied calmly, "Maybe. But I think true success doesn't need to be shouted about. It speaks for itself." His words seemed to carry weight throughout the cabin. A few passengers nodded discreetly, while others shot disapproving looks at Victor, who clearly wasn't used to being challenged this way. By this point, the atmosphere in first class had shifted. Many passengers were now fully tuned into the exchange between Keanu and Victor. An older man sitting nearby turned to observe more closely, shaking his head as if to express disapproval of Victor's behavior. Victor, aware of the stares, tried to hide his irritation, but instead of backing down, he threw out another jab. "Cheap philosophy," Victor scoffed. "It might sound nice, but the real world doesn't work that way." Keanu looked at him, still maintaining the same tranquil expression. "The real world is made by people, Victor. And in the end, how we treat others says more about who we are than anything else." Victor was visibly uncomfortable with the response. He glanced around, noticing that the passengers' attention was no longer in his favor. Some whispered among themselves, while others stared directly at him, their expressions ranging from curiosity to disapproval. Victor was beginning to realize that his strategy of dominance wasn't working. He thought he had the upper hand, but the impact of Keanu's words was changing the perception of the passengers and perhaps even his own. The tension in the cabin was palpable. Victor crossed his arms, trying to mask the discomfort caused by Keanu's words, but his irritation was starting to show. Keanu, however, seemed unaffected by the atmosphere. He turned directly to Victor and broke the silence with a calm tone. "You know, Victor, I understand what you're saying. The world can be very competitive, but I've learned that sometimes the need to prove something to others comes from something deeper, an insecurity, an inner struggle." Victor furrowed his brow, unsure whether this was a provocation or a genuine attempt at conversation. "Inner struggle," he said, laughing. "I don't know where you got that idea, but you couldn't be more wrong." Keanu gave a slight smile and shook his head. "Maybe, but I've met many people who thought success was all about what others could see. Deep down, they were just trying to feel something missing inside them." The words hit Victor in an unexpected way. He fell silent for a moment, fiddling with the wedding band on his finger almost absent-mindedly, but he quickly recovered his defensive tone. "That's not me. Everything I've achieved, I worked hard for, and I don't need anyone telling me how to live my life." Keanu remained calm, as if carefully choosing his next words. He observed Victor for a few seconds before continuing. "I'm not saying you didn't work hard. I just think that sometimes we get so caught up in the idea of showing off what we've achieved that we forget to look inward. Who are we without all of this?" Victor pressed his lips together, visibly uncomfortable. The question seemed to echo in his mind, but he wasn't ready to admit that it struck a chord. "Who are we?" he replied with a cynical laugh. "We're what we build. Without it, we're nothing." Keanu held his gaze, his expression now more serious. "I disagree. I think we're defined by what we do for others, not by what we accumulate. And in the end, the things we show the world matter less than what we carry inside." He pointed to his chest, and his words resonated throughout the cabin. Some passengers nodded subtly, while Victor appeared to struggle to maintain his composure. "That's easy for you to say," Victor said, almost rising from his seat. "You don't know anything about me. You don't know what I've been through to get here." Keanu responded firmly, but without raising his voice. You're right. I don't know your story, but I don't think I need to know it to see that sometimes when someone feels the need to shout about what they've achieved, it's because they're trying to hide something. Fear, insecurity, loneliness. The statement hit like a brick. Victor froze, his face flushed with anger and perhaps shame. He clenched his fists, clearly struggling to contain an outburst. Finally, losing his composure, Victor stood up abruptly, knocking his empty champagne glass to the floor. "You think you're better than me?" he shouted, drawing the attention of everyone in the cabin. "Sitting there with your clever little phrases, acting like you know everything about life? But you don't know a thing about what it's like to live in the real world." The passengers fell silent, shocked by Victor's outburst. The flight attendant quickly approached, trying to defuse the situation. Keanu remained seated, looking at Victor calmly. He waited for the man to finish speaking before responding. "I don't think I'm better than you," he said with a tone that was firm yet gentle. "I just think that sometimes we need to stop and think about what really matters. And Victor, you don't have to prove anything to anyone." The words seemed to strike Victor deeply. He was breathing heavily, but something in Keanu's voice made him sit down again. He averted his gaze, looking more defeated than angry. Victor sat in silence, Keanu's words echoing in his mind. He had never felt so exposed, so vulnerable in front of so many people, but he still didn't know that the worst, or perhaps the best, was yet to come. The flight continued in a heavier silence after the confrontation. Victor remained in his seat, avoiding looking at Keanu, but it was evident he was deeply unsettled. Keanu, on the other hand, seemed completely relaxed, as if nothing had happened. A short while later, the flight attendant approached Keanu with a polite smile. Her voice caught the attention of the entire cabin. "Mr. Reeves, the captain asked me to inform you that your connection in Tokyo is confirmed. He also sends his best regards." The mention of Keanu's name seemed to ripple through the cabin, and Victor's face paled. He had been arguing with someone whose reputation for humility and kindness was well known. The realization hit him like a wave, and for the first time, Victor seemed to truly grasp the weight of his own behavior. He sank deeper into his seat, his earlier bravado replaced by a quiet, introspective silence. The flight continued, but the dynamic had shifted irreversibly, leaving Victor to confront not just Keanu's words, but the reflection of himself they had revealed. The name Reeves seemed to ripple through first class, catching the attention of passengers who had, until then, been quietly observing the exchange. Some widened their eyes in recognition, and a murmur began to spread through the cabin. It was at that moment that Victor froze. "Reeves," he murmured, almost in disbelief. "Keanu Reeves?" Keanu nodded politely to the flight attendant, thanking her for the update about his connection in Tokyo. He didn't pay much attention to the commotion his name had caused. Turning back to Victor, who now looked at him as if he were seeing a ghost, Keanu asked with a slight smile, "Is something wrong, Victor?" Victor opened his mouth but couldn't form a coherent sentence. He glanced around, noticing other passengers observing him with curious and, in some cases, disapproving glances. He looked completely lost, his earlier bravado evaporating. Sinking into his seat, clearly uncomfortable, Victor began mumbling, trying to justify his actions. I had no idea. I mean, you didn't say who you were," he finally stammered. "I didn't know that you were... you." Keanu kept his tone calm, but there was a firmness in his words. "I didn't think it was necessary. I don't usually use my name as a calling card." Victor remained silent for a moment before attempting to defend himself. "Look, I didn't mean to offend you. I just didn't know who I was talking to." Keanu let out a small sigh and leaned forward slightly. "Victor, what you said doesn't change just because you now know my name." The truth doesn't depend on who you're speaking to. It depends on how you choose to treat people. The words left Victor speechless. He looked at Keanu, then at the other passengers, who now seemed even more attentive to what was unfolding. The humiliation on his face was undeniable. The silence in the cabin was broken by Keanu, who decided to conclude the conversation with a final lesson. You know, Victor, life is hard enough for everyone. The last thing we need is people trying to put others down to make themselves feel bigger. Victor nodded slightly, unable to argue. For the first time, he seemed to genuinely reflect on his actions. Keanu leaned back in his seat, effectively ending the conversation. Meanwhile, Victor remained motionless, staring at his hands as if replaying every word in his mind. He wasn't just confronted by Keanu, but by reality itself. He began to realize that, in his attempt to humiliate someone else, he had revealed more about himself than he ever intended. The remainder of the flight was marked by a heavy silence. Victor, who once seemed like he owned the space, now looked visibly uncomfortable. He could barely meet the eyes of Keanu or the other passengers. The arrogance he carried at the start of the journey had disappeared, replaced by something much closer to shame. As the minutes passed, Victor couldn't stop thinking about Keanu's words. Everything he had said seemed so simple, yet at the same time it struck deeply. Victor began questioning his own behavior, recalling how many times he had judged people without even trying to know them. Maybe he's right, Victor murmured to himself without realizing it. He glanced at Keanu, who was calmly reading a book, as if nothing had happened. This only amplified the impact of the situation. Keanu hadn't made any effort to prove himself. He had simply let his actions speak for him. As the plane began to prepare for landing, Victor finally mustered the courage to say something. He turned to Keanu, his eyes still lowered, and said, "I need to apologize. Not for what I said just because you're you, but because I was arrogant. I acted like an idiot." Keanu looked at him, his expression as tranquil as ever. He waited a moment before responding. "I appreciate the apology, but more than that, I hope you learn from this." Victor nodded slowly, realizing that those words were an opportunity for change. Then Keanu continued. "Sometimes what we search for most in the world is what we find least within ourselves. I hope you figure out what really matters." Victor remained silent, but Keanu's words stayed in his mind. He knew that moment had the potential to change something inside him, if he allowed it. After disembarking, Victor stood still in the terminal, watching Keanu walk away. He saw fans discreetly approach him to greet him and take pictures. Keanu greeted each one with patience and a genuine smile, without haste or arrogance. It was evident that his simplicity and kindness came from within. Victor looked down at his own hands and sighed. He knew he needed to change. Keanu's words still echoed in his mind, a reminder that a person's true worth isn't about their status, but about how they choose to treat others. As Keanu disappeared into the airport crowd, Victor felt something new. Hope. Maybe that encounter hadn't been a coincidence. Maybe it was a chance to start over. In the end, we all carry choices that shape who we are. Are we living to impress others or to become better people? Keanu's words leave a clear lesson. True success isn't about what you achieve or show off, but about the positive impact you leave on the world and the lives of those around you. So, the next time you find yourself in a situation of judgment or conflict, remember, respect and humility never go out of style. And perhaps the change you want to see in the world needs to start with you. If you enjoyed this story, we have many more that will warm your heart.